The Mongols came back, and this time the wall was waiting for them. 7 years after the first invasion broke against the beaches of Kyushu, the Kamakura shogunate had transformed Hakata Bay into a fortress of stone, a barrier roughly 2 meters high running along the shoreline where the enemy was most likely to land. The Hojo Regency, with real power held by the Shikken Hojo Tokimune, had taxed the warrior houses of Kyushu without mercy to raze it. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. The first invasion, the Bunhei Campaign of 1274, had been a warning the Japanese refused to forget. Kublai Khan, founder of the Yuan dynasty he had proclaimed in 1271, was not a man who abandoned ambitions. By 1279, he had completed the conquest of Song China and the resources of a continent now bent toward the islands that still defied him. The Gokunin warriors who manned the coastal watches understood this. They drilled, they waited, and they wondered when the sails would return. But what the defenders on that wall could not know, what no chronicle of the age would record, was that the thing they trusted most to save them would, this time, simply fail to arrive. The invasion force that Kublai assembled in 1281 was built to crush, not merely to test. It came in two parts: the Eastern Route Army sailing from Goryeo, Korea, under the Korean-born Yuan General Hong Dagu, with the Goryeo Admiral Kim Bang-gyeong commanding the Korean contingent, and the far larger Southern Route Army of former Song troops under Fan Wenhu, sailing from the conquered south of China. Together, traditional accounts placed the armada near 4,400 ships, among the largest naval operations the pre-modern world had ever seen. King Chungnyeol of Goryeo, a Yuan vassal, had been compelled to surrender the ships, the crews, and the provisions to make it possible. The two fleets were meant to rendezvous and strike as one. They did not. The Eastern Route Army arrived first and impatient, and threw itself against the defenses around Hakata Bay before its partner had even cleared the southern coast. There, at the wall, the campaign found its rhythm of attrition. The samurai sortied in small boats by night, boarding anchored ships and burning them. The Mongols answered with massed archery and gunpowder bombs. Around Shiga Island and Takashima, the fighting dragged across the weeks of summer, neither side able to force a decision. Both grinding down, the defenders held. But holding is not winning, and every day the larger fleet drew nearer. And then came the night that, in our history, decided everything. In mid-August of 1281, a typhoon swept across the waters off Kyushu and shattered the anchored armada, drowning tens of thousands, an event the Japanese would later mythologize as the Kamikaze, the divine wind. It was the storm that saved a nation. Here, it does not form. The skies over Hakata Bay stay clear. The seas stay calm. The reunited fleets of the Eastern and Southern Route armies ride at anchor through a still summer night, unbroken. There is nothing mystical in its absence. Weather is only weather, and a season that might have birthed a storm simply did not. But the consequence is total. At dawn, the full weight of the Yuan force, Mongol, Chinese, and Korean together, begins a concentrated landing against a Japanese line already worn thin by weeks of skirmishing. The defenders had spent themselves holding against a fraction of this army. Now the whole of it came ashore at once, in disciplined order, where the wall was weakest. The wall broke where stone met numbers. Mongol tactics had always rested on coordination the samurai could not match. Massed cavalry, infantry moving in disciplined blocks, concentrated archery, and the gunpowder bombs called tetsuhao that scattered formations and panicked horses. Against a defensive barrier, these were slower to tell, but the defenders were too few to man every span. The invaders fixed their assault on a single section, saturated it with bombardment, and poured through the gap they tore open. The samurai counterattacked the way they knew how, boldly, individually, seeking the single honorable duel. It was the wrong war. Where one warrior charged, 10 disciplined infantrymen closed around him. The Gokunin, who had held the line for weeks now, died in the open fields behind it. Shoni Kagasuke, coordinating the warrior houses, could not concentrate enough strength quickly enough to seal the breach. Takezaki Suenaga, who had fought in both invasions, would in our timeline live to commission scrolls celebrating a victory. Here there would be no scrolls and no victory to record. Within weeks, northern Kyushu had fallen. A regency that cannot protect its vassals cannot command them. The Hojo had built their authority on a simple exchange. The warrior houses gave service and loyalty, and in return received protection and reward, land, title, security. With Kyushu overrun, that exchange collapsed. There was no conquered enemy territory to distribute, no spoils, only loss. The Gokunin had bankrupted themselves building the wall and manning it, and the regency had nothing left to give them. So the bonds dissolved. Rival houses watching the Hojo fail began to calculate their own survival. Some chose to bargain separately with the invaders rather than die for a regency that could no longer shield them. The Mongols, as they had everywhere, were willing to rule through those who submitted. What had been a unified defense fractured into 100 private decisions, and each defection made the next one easier. The authority that had governed Japan for a century did not fall in a single battle. It came apart, house by house. The Mongols did not come only to destroy, they came to govern, as they governed everywhere. Across their empire, the Yuan had a method for conquered lands, and they applied it now to Japan as they had to Korea, a branch secretariat, an administrative organ overlaying the islands, ruling not by replacing every local lord, but by working through those who proved cooperative. The Khan's interest was never simply conquest for its own sake, it was integration. The islands, so long turned inward, were now routed into something vastly larger, the maritime trade network that bound the Yuan Empire from the China coast through Korea and outward across the seas. Japanese silver, sulfur, lacquer, and craft flowed into continental markets. Continental goods, coin, and administrators flowed back. The local lords who had bargained their way into Yuan favor became the empire's instruments, collecting its taxes and keeping its peace. It was not gentle, but it was a system, and systems endure where mere plunder cannot. When the warriors who patronized a faith disappear, the faith itself begins to change. Zen Buddhism had taken root among the Kamakura elite, patronized by Hojo Tokimune himself, its discipline and detachment well suited to men who lived by the sword. But the regency was gone, and its warrior class scattered, and the patrons who had given Zen its place at the center of power faded with them. The Yuan, for all their violence in war, governed with a broad religious tolerance, and into the space they opened, other devotions grew. Pure Land Buddhism, with its promise of salvation for ordinary people rather than disciplined elites, found fertile ground among a population no longer organized for war. The Tibetan-influenced Buddhism favored at the Yuan court traveled the trade routes into the islands, and the continental cults that followed merchants found new room as well. The spiritual map of Japan redrew itself not by decree, but by the slow pressure of who now held power and what they valued. A people reshaped for commerce rather than combat reached naturally for different gods. The way of the samurai was never written, because the world that would have written it never came. In our history, the warrior ethic matured across centuries of independent shogunal rule, refined into a code of loyalty, honor, and disciplined service that later generations would name and revere. That maturation required a shogunate to nurture it, an autonomous warrior government, free of imperial overlords, evolving its own ideals across long centuries. Here, that government died in the summer of 1281, before the code could crystallize. The warrior remained, but as a provincial functionary of a foreign empire, not the heir to an unbroken martial tradition. What becomes of such a place is the question this divergence finally asks, and it is not one we can answer with certainty. An island culture, long accustomed to isolation, has been absorbed into the largest land empire in history. Perhaps it endures quietly as a province, its old identity dissolving into the empire's vast administrative weave. Or perhaps as the Yuan themselves frayed in the generations after Kublai, as all empires fray, the islands at the edge of the map slowly gather their distinctness again and reassert something of what they had been. The wind that did not blow took one future, What it gave in return, history would have had to live to learn,